of 2020. We've had Writers House Fellows, but not in person. So we are putting our hands together, not just for the great Amitav Ghosh, but that would be sufficient. We are putting our hands together for being together in one room, a lot of people safely together, vaccinated and boosted and testified and masked. Thank you. This is Writers House Fellows. We've been doing this for 23 years, and it is such a fun thing. The center of it is an undergraduate seminar. Amitav spent 2.5 hours with us this afternoon and then rushed over for a rehearsal that I'm going to describe in a second. And so we're so grateful to everybody for turning your phones off. How many of you are at an event in person like this, an event like this, for the first time in 2 years? Okay, I've got 2 books I'm giving away for this. Okay. This is Dancing in Cambodia, which you referred to.
Oh, you didn't know there would be giveaways.
Giveaways. And here, can you share that? Are you guys together? Can you share this? Okay, this is the shadow line. That's just from us, from the Writers House to you, for coming to an event, a literary event, for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. Deborah won't be happy that I'm calling her out, but we're honored that you're here, Deborah Baker. Thank you for making the trip to be with us. I wanted to acknowledge Deborah Thomas, whom I'm seeing there. Do you mind? Yeah, so Deborah is the founder and director, if I've got this right, of the Center for Experimental Ethnography, which is sponsoring Amitav's time here. And if you haven't engaged with the center, this is a good chance. Maybe afterwards, while Amitav is signing books, you can talk to Deb about the work that they've been doing, and we're so happy to be partners with them. Brooke O'Hara is here, I think on this side of the room. There's Brooke. So Brooke is working with Amitav and others on a production of Jungle Nama, and that, I believe, is happening on March 2nd and 3rd. Am I correct? And it is useless to announce it because I hear that it's all sold out.
No. I think we're going to move to a larger theater.
Ooh, excited.
We're working it out.
That's great. So March 2nd and 3rd, I think 7 p.m. is the start time both those nights.
Yeah.
Am I well informed? Okay.
And then, maybe wait a few days and there will hopefully be more seats available.
Okay, so we will get the word out. In fact, if Brooke reminds me, we have the addresses of everybody's here because you did RSVP, so we can get the word out. But that's going to be fun, and everybody's been involved in the rehearsals and so forth. I want to thank Zach and Henry and whoever else has been doing the tech tonight. We have books for sale, and so immediately, some of you have already bought them, but immediately after the event, you can go to the living room and look over that way into the alcove, and there's copies of The Hungry Tide and copies of the novel Gun Island, which is a recent novel, and the new book, The Nutmeg's Curse. And we have those 3 books, and there's also a special treat that Lily will describe in a second. So please buy a book, steal a book, get a book, have it handed out to you because you came after the pandemic. And then if you're okay with it, you'll stay here and sign books afterwards for a certain amount of time. I want to thank Lily Applebaum, who is the coordinator of Writers House Fellows. I guess Lily is recovering from a fall and has done yo person's work to just make it all happen. We don't recommend that you go down the back stairs of the Writers House from the 2nd floor. Do it slowly. Hold the rail. Don't hit your head. You know what Amitav said? Why don't you put up a sign?
Genius idea.
You could run an institution.
I could never run an institution.
I think that's probably true, but whatever, I mean, at least you had the sign idea. So today we had the seminar, a long session with Amitav with the students. Tomorrow morning we're back here in this room, same place, at 10:30 a.m. for conversation Q&A, right? So tonight is a larger audience. Will be some Q&A at the end, but tomorrow is your chance to, and it's not a holiday, so you got to skip work, or skip your class or whatever, and join the two of us and others at 10:30. And if you haven't RSVP'd, just let Lily know. We'll get you. We'd love to have you join us for that. You can just come. Okay, great. I want to thank the students in the Writers House Fellow Seminar who are all over, usually in the back. But would you guys raise your hand? Thank you all for devoting really a month and a half reading and talking about this extraordinary writer. So Lily, in a minute, is going to present something special to Amitav. And then Mehek Boparai is going to come up and give an introduction. Mehek, you can sit here at my mic to do that. And then what we're going to do is a kind of curated reading of passages that we've worked out with a little back and forth, and maybe at the end some Q&A. So thank you all again for coming, and it's time for Lily.
Okay, I just want to echo Al's thanks to everyone for coming out in person. As he said, this is our first in-person Writers House event since Saidiya Hartman was here in February 2020. So that was a long time ago. Pandemic years count triple, as we all know. So thank you again. I'm here on behalf of the Fellows class to present a gift to you, Amitav. We, in collaboration with the Common Press and designed by Mary Tassilo, we have printed a broadside, and it's in the form of a little postcard. And we printed a quote that we discussed quite at length in our class about the nutmeg's curse. I don't know if you would be interested in.
Read it upside down?
Oh yeah, would you? Well, I'm embarrassed to read Amitav's work to him, but okay, I will read it. It says, storytelling, far from setting humans apart from animals, is actually the most important residue of our formerly wild selves. So that's a quote from the Nutmeg's Curse, and I would love to present you with a few copies of the postcard.
Thank you so much. That's so kind of you, so thoughtful.
And thank you for being here with us in person, and you all in attendance can grab your own copy of the postcard on the book selling table, and they're for free. So
you can also get them to sign it.
Yes, of course.
So thank you so much, Amitav. And now I'm going to call up Mehek Boparai, who is our student in the Writers House Fellow Seminar, most recently seen on Jeopardy, not to brag. And she is going to give Amitav a proper introduction.
Just don't ask her about sports, and she's great. No, that's true, right?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. In his essay, The Testimony of My Grandfather's Bookcase, Amitav Ghosh presents us with the paradox of the novel as a form. He writes, "Those of us who love novels often read them because of the eloquence with which they communicate a sense of place. Yet the truth is that it is the very loss of a lived sense of place that makes their fictional representation possible. It is this paradox of placelessness that his writing works diligently to identify, to carve out narratives for not only the people of the planet, but the environment we occupy as well. He fuses together emotionality and rich tradition with the reality of our changing world to create a depth in his work, depth that pushes us to ask the question of how we use memory and culture to process the present. Through Amitav's work, we are given historical facts, locations, and experiences. And across all genres, he guides us to piece together how they are connected and where we find ourselves. He does not hesitate to startle us, to make us fearful or aware of what is happening out of our desire for more. Yet he never fails to bring us back to the light behind this horror. As we grow numb to news articles and statistics, Amitav reminds us that we harbor the capacity to do better. Above all else, he is a storyteller, which he argues is the most animalistic trait one can have. To be presented with knowledge is not sufficient. Amitav's writing shows us how to make something real of this knowledge through his compelling novels and essays. As an Indian American, I found immense comfort and relief in Amitav's work, for it resurfaced parts of my life and upbringing that I've spent so much time rewiring and rewriting. I saw shades of myself in his brooding protagonists, in the rejection of folklore for its use of coincidence, in the attraction of history over heritage. But it is as a human and as a part of this planet that I recognize the need to protect the ones I love and the ground we share. Amitav sharpens the lens we've always had for seeing things, without forgoing the space we need to draw our own conclusions. He reminds us that the time to sort our values is now, and that these values are not so different from the people around you. He leaves each of us to ask nuanced questions, to ponder how our individual choices are entangled rather than mutually exclusive of the crises we witness daily. What we observe in presumably different corners of humanity, from the storms in the Sundarbans to the effects of colonization in North America, are intrinsically connected and affected by our daily routines. Reading his writings together in the Kelly Writers House Fellows Seminar and talking intensely about his work every Monday together, we have begun to slowly relearn not our sense of space, but how we must interact with it, and the symbiosis of this relationship. We have found that Amitav's brilliance is not that he recognizes the novel's ability to strip us of our sense of location, but that his writing pushes us to restore it, word by word. It has been a powerful experience to read and talk together about the work of this eminent writer, our first 2022 Kelly Writers House Fellow. I am honored to be the one to introduce him to you and to welcome him to the Writers House. Please, let's all warmly welcome him, Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you so much, Mehak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehak. That was great. Well, we have 5 passages that we picked out, and it could turn to 4 because we don't want to, we want to give ourselves some leisure. The first one is probably the longest. It is the longest of the passages. It's from the new book, The Nutmeg's Curse. And it's the first page. For those of you who are following along, you have your Bible at home. It's the first part of the chapter 17 on utopias. And here we go.
Yes. Well, first of all, let me thank you, Al, for inviting me to be here. And thank you very much, Mehak, for that very generous introduction. And it was great to meet your class today and to have these very extended conversations with your students. Great students, as I've come to see at UPenn. I mean, incredibly quick and clever and adaptable and amazing students, really. Like Ari sitting here, who's in Jungle Nama. So it's been such a pleasure to work with all of you and such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Let me tell you, first of all, I'm a terrible reader. And I have an accent, so you probably won't understand a word I'm saying. An essential step towards the silencing of non-human voices was to imagine that only humans are capable of telling stories. This again is not an idea that people have always subscribed to. Many, perhaps most of the world's people still don't. It is essentially another elite idea that gained ground with the onward march of the mechanistic metaphysic. Yet today, the idea that humans are the only storytelling animals appears self-evident to those who subscribe to it. Consider, for instance, this passage from one of the finest portrayals of a landscape in contemporary literature, Graham Swift's superb 1983 novel, Waterland. Only animals, says one of Swift's characters, live entirely in the here and now. Only nature knows neither memory nor history. But man, let me offer you a definition, is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys of trail signs of stories. This passage serves as the epigraph for a fine article by the environmental historian William Cronon. The article is on the nature of narrative, and Cronon argues that the fundamental difference between a mere succession of events, which he calls a chronology, and a story is that the latter joins events together in a way that invests them with meaning. This, he assumes, is a specific human ability. Hence, I quote, narrative is a peculiarly human way of organizing reality, unquote. So once again, what is really at stake is not so much storytelling itself, but rather the question of who can make meaning. Once again, the assumption is that non-humans cannot make or discern meaning. As with so many other attempts to define the exceptionalism of human beings, This idea is tenable only if meaning-making and storytelling are defined in a circular fashion, as being tied to human forms of language. But is it really the case that experiences cannot have any meaning in the absence of language? Clearly, this does not obtain for pre-linguistic humans. It is well known that even infants understand and make many kinds of meaning. So why should it not be possible to connect experiences into meaningful patterns in other ways, through memory, sight, or smell, for instance? Any pet owner knows that a dog understands as meaningful the relationship between the home, the park, and certain times of day. For the dog, is this a chronology or a narrative? Either way, it is clearly not the case that the dog lives entirely in the here and now. Its experiences are sequential and are understood to unfold in time and space. The importance of sequencing will be evident to anyone who has ever tried to write a story. A narrative is nothing if not an arrangement of a sequence of events. This is why the sentences that connect one paragraph to another are of such vital importance. They provide the sequential connections between events and places out of which a meaningful narrative emerges. This kind of narrative sequencing is analogous to movement through time as well as space. That is exactly what is meant by the unfolding of a story. That may account for why so many of the world's earliest and most powerful narratives are stories that unfold through movement. For example, the Ramayana, the Odyssey, the Norse sagas, the Journey to the West, and so on. It is well established now that many animals have long memories and are able to communicate in complex ways. Some of these animals, like elephants, whales, and migratory birds, also move over immense distances and appear to have attachments to particular places. These movements cannot be described as purely mechanical, instinctive, or lacking in meaningful sequences. Humpback whales, for instance, mark the passage of time by changing their songs from year to year. This would hardly be possible if they lived entirely in the here and now. As far back as the 1930s, the biologist Jakob von Uexküll demonstrated that many animals actively interpret their surroundings, creating their own experiential worlds. This idea has long been anathema to those who believe that it is a cardinal error to attribute human qualities to animals. But as Eileen Christ has so persuasively shown in her book, Images of Animals, Anthropomorphism and Animal Mind, to rigorously avoid anthropomorphism is only to risk falling into the related fallacy of mechanomorphism, the assumption that animals are machine-like creatures that cannot, in principle, be endowed with minds or interpretive faculties. In short, there are many good reasons to conclude, as Donna Haraway does, that, I quote, storying cannot any longer be put into the box of human exceptionalism. The anthropologist Tom Van Duren goes further. In a fascinating study of a flock of penguins who doggedly return year after year to the shores of a Sydney suburb, he concludes that the bird's attachment to the place arises out of what he calls storying. He writes, I quote, experiencing beings like penguins represent the world to themselves too. They do not just take in sensory data as unfiltered and meaningless phenomena, but weave meaning out of experiences so that they, like humans, inhabit an endlessly storied world, unquote. It would seem then that the idea that humans are the only storytelling animal is by no means an unproblematic reflection of reality. It is something that some people like to believe, just as some once believed that most humans were brutes and thus incapable of making meaning. It is, in other words, a construct, one that is intimately connected with structures of power and with the forceful repression of the awareness of non-human forms of agency and expression. Not surprisingly, in this matter too, the hand of power has often fallen hardest on indigenous people. When we think of the suppression of stories today, our minds leap immediately to dissident literature and authoritarian regimes. Yet there were other kinds of stories that were also suppressed or repressed for quite different reasons over much longer spans of time. For example, the Humaha narratives of the Laguna Pueblo. In Leslie Marmon Silko's words, these stories are about the conversations that, I quote, coyotes, crows, and buzzards used to have with human beings, unquote. In her memoir, The Turquoise Ledge, Silko recalls how, in her childhood, Hamaha stories could not be mentioned in certain public spaces because they revealed the Laguna spiritual outlook towards animals, plants, and spirit beings, unquote. The stories existed in the shadows as a secret law. It's perfectly possible, then, that far from being an exclusively human attribute, the narrative faculty is the most animal of human abilities, a product of one of the traits that humans indisputably share with animals and many other beings, that is, attachments to place. Perhaps, then, storytelling, far from setting humans apart from animals, is actually the most important residue of our formerly wild selves. This would explain why stories, above all, are quintessentially the domain of human imaginative life, in which non-humans had voices, and where non-human agency was fully recognized and even celebrated. To make this leap may be difficult in other more prosaic domains of thought, but it was by no means a stretch in the world of storytelling, where anything is possible. The shrinking of the possibilities of this domain and the consequent erasure of non-human voices from serious literature has played no small part in creating that blindness to other beings that is so marked a feature of official modernity. It follows, then, that if those non-human voices are to be restored to their proper place, then it must be, in the first instance, through the medium of stories. This is the great burden that now rests upon writers, artists, filmmakers, and everyone else who is involved in the telling of stories. To us falls the task of imaginatively restoring agency and voice to non-humans. As with all the most important artistic endeavors in human history, this is a task that is at once aesthetic and political. And because of the magnitude of the crisis that now besets the planet, it is freighted with the most pressing moral urgency.
Thank you, Amitav, for reading
Thank
that
you.
passage. One question, which will be asked quickly, but it's huge, so, do what you will with it, and then we'll move to the next passage. The plan is to imaginatively restore agency and voice to non-humans through writing across the genres, writers, artists, filmmakers, etc. But you have chosen to work in the genre that arguably is the hardest to achieve that, the novel. Because the novel arises when all this mess arises. It coincides with the creation of this problem, and it is so committed to people in the middle of its storying. So, boy, you set yourself a challenge, and I guess the one way to ask this question is, in your recent fiction, what are some of the things you've tried to do to reform the novel as a genre, to see if you can achieve some of these, to respond to this great burden that you're describing?
To say reform is perhaps to make too large a claim. And also, we all recognize that the novel is a very powerful form. It has certain techniques which are incredibly powerful, like the setting of scenes, like the creation of characters, and so on. But I think we have to find other resources to draw upon. And for me, the resource that I have been drawing upon most, I think, is really pre-modern fiction, And fortunately for me, I read Bengali, So, I went back to reading a lot of pre-modern Bengali narratives. These narratives are very different in some way from novels in that they're, in the first place, they're in verse. But at the same time, they're also very like novels, because, these stories, which are essentially praise poems to various gods and goddesses, they're actually just like novels. They have scenes, they have characters. Most of all, they have lots of dialogue. These characters are constantly sort of engaged in dialogues with each other, So in many ways, they're actually very novelistic in their techniques. But I went back to them, and I must say what was really striking to me, when I started reading 15th, 16th century Bengali narratives of this kind, was the discovery that they are so much more engaged with the world around us than modern Bengali fiction. It's a really striking thing. They're all about famines, floods, tidal waves, hunger, and most of all, about snakes. Snakes are such an important aspect of
Big snake on
Indian
the front of this book.
Snakes are really what make it impossible for people from an Indic tradition to think of themselves being in mastery of nature. If you live with snakes, you can never feel that you have mastered nature because snakes will rid you of that idea. But it's really an astonishing thing that, so many of the greatest sort of epics, like the Mahabharata, begins entirely with snakes. It's about the snake kingdoms. The snake kings play a very important part in the Mahabharata. So it's really interesting to see how actually, pre-modern narratives are in so many ways so much better suited, to our time.
And at the same time, you grew up with your grandfather's bookcase full of European novels translated variously. And in and among those and the other novels that you came to know, tell us about a couple that are wild and crazy and break the rules and are interested in non-humans and other kinds of agencies. I mean, you read, of course, as a boy, you read all of the standards of 18th and 19th century fiction, but I'm thinking of Moby Dick to start with. That's a book that you have praised.
Moby Dick, I think, is the greatest novel ever written.
There we go.
Honestly.
Has everybody read it? Okay. There's an animal in there that's kind of important and communicates.
Yeah, I mean, even in the mid 19th century, Melville was taking this enormous gamble of granting agency, intelligence, and character to a non-human being.
Yeah.
And Melville, in many ways, I think Melville, his process was like mine. I mean, he was a kind of journalist. He went out, interviewed the captain of the Essex, who had actually lived through this experience. And so much of his work is actually ethnographic, Redburn, I mean, his memoir, then his ethnography of the ships. He is, I think, genuinely the most interesting novelist of the English, certainly, novelist of the 19th century. He's the only English language novelist who notices non-white sailors. It's an astonishing thing. I mean, people always say Conrad. In all of Conrad's work, I've never seen a non-white sailor with a name. I mean, he never even gives them names. I mean, they're not human beings for him. Whereas, Melville's book about his first voyage, Redburn, he ends up at Liverpool, and, he goes on to this ship where there are these Bengali sailors, and he talks to them. It's kind of incredible, all the work that he does also in the South Pacific and so on. So I do think Melville is somehow, it's like a crack in the firmament.
Yes,
I mean,
definitely.
something shines through in some bizarre way.
Yeah. Well, when you read the last paragraph, which is a real summa in this book, it is the burden of all writers now to do this. You were very strong and almost programmatic there. And you talked about aesthetic and political. On the aesthetic side, there is Moby Dick. On the content side, there's Moby Dick, Melville enabling the whale to be a major character. But on the aesthetic side, as you mentioned, there's all the cetology and all the extraneous information and the crazy structure, which you, in your novels, seem, not just from Melville, but you are really devoted to a structure that is not going to be your standard narrative or chronicle.
For me, in The Hungry Tide, Moby Dick was so much the inspiration.
Yes.
Because you remember that amazing chapter where he says, the whale is a fish. The whale is not a mammal. The whale is a fish. He had his ideas, but it's completely, he takes a position there.
Yeah.
He thinks that the whale is a fish.
Yeah.
And he's not shy of telling you that.
Yes, thank you. Let's turn to a passage from the novel Gun Island. And this is, Dean is our first person narrator, Dean. Once in a while, Dean sounds like you, but mostly he doesn't. This is page 235, Amitav.
Yes.
And he is depressed. We know that. He may not know it as much as we know it. And his friend Cinta tries to frame and re-explain what this depression might be on 235 to 237, for those of you who have.
I should explain, Chinta is an older woman who's a scholar. She's a historian of Venice and so on. Anyway, so she calls Dean Dino, like Dean Martin. Here she is, she's speaking. Didn't you just say, Dino, that you feel yourself fading away, that you're losing your will? So I did. Do you know what that is a symptom of? Maybe depression, says Dino. You can call it that if you like, but there are other ways of looking at it as well. When I was writing my book about the Inquisition in Venice, I read hundreds of case files that described those symptoms. The cases were adjudicated by inquisitors, and many of them were about magical practices and spirit possession. That may lead you to think that these cases were about ghostly apparitions or things flying about in the sky. But that was not it at all. Almost always, these cases were about the loss of will and freedom, volontà e libertà. A victim thinks that she is being prevailed on to do things she would not normally do of her own will. Or someone feels that a spell has been put on them, or that they have been given a potion that has made them fall in love with someone they would not otherwise have cared for. A wife might believe that someone has put a spell on her husband to steal him from her. A son may imagine that someone has bewitched his father so that he is wasting his wealth. A girl is convinced that she has been robbed of her will to the point that she cannot get out of bed or even move her limbs. They are all beset by a feeling that inexplicable forces are acting upon them in such a way that they are no longer in control of what happens to them. Most cases of possession are exactly like that. She looked into my eyes and smiled. And are these not your own symptoms? I stared at her in disbelief. Chinta, are you really trying to tell me that I am possessed, that my soul has been stolen? She smiled. No, Dino, no, that is not at all what I am saying. You and I don't live in a world where it's possible to be possessed in the old sense. These things happened to our ancestors because their will and their sense of their presence in the world were essential to their very survival. To get by, they had to depend on the soil, the weather, animals, neighbors, family, and so on, none of which would yield what they needed just for the asking in the manner of, say, a cash machine or a ticket agent at the stazione. Everything they depended on for their livelihood could fight back and resist, no matter whether it was a spouse or a horse, let alone the wind and the weather. Merely to survive, they needed to assert their presence, or they would have been overwhelmed. They would have become shadows of themselves. That is why possession, the loss of presence, was a matter of such anxiety for them. You and I face no such threat. We live in a world of impersonal systems. We don't have to impose our presence on a cash machine in order to get our money. We don't have to exert our will on our cell phones in order to make them work. In our circumstances, no one needs to assert their presence in order to get by from day to day. And since it is not needed, that sense of presence slowly fades or is lost and forgotten. It's easier to let the systems take over. It took me a couple of minutes to work out the implications of what she was saying. But if that's true, Chinta, I said, then what you're implying is that people today, people like us, are already possessed. She smiled in her enigmatic way. All I can say, Dino, is that when I look at this world, our world, with the diagnostic tools of an inquisitor, it becomes impossible to avoid a simple conclusion, which is that the world of today presents all the symptoms of demonic possession. I gasped. What? You can't be serious, Chinta. In what sense does it present the symptoms of demonic possession? Just look around you, Caro. There was a touch of weariness in her voice now. Everybody knows what must be done if the world is to continue to be a livable place. If our homes are not to be invaded by the sea or by creatures like that spider. Everybody knows. And yet we are powerless, even the most powerful among us. We go about our daily business through habit, as though we were in the grip of forces that have overwhelmed our will. We see shocking and monstrous things happening all around us, and we avert our eyes. We surrender ourselves willingly to whatever it is that has us in its power. She smiled and reached out to pat my hand. That is why whatever is happening to you is not possession. Rather, I would say that it is a risveglio, a kind of awakening. It may be dangerous, of course, but that is because you're waking up to things that you had never imagined or sensed before. You are lucky, Dino. Some unknown force has given you a great gift.
Thank you. That was a wonderful passage.
Thank you.
So, one of the most basic things she's doing is helping us, readers, and my students felt this keenly, redefine depression as, you know, the world is going to hell, the seas are rising, the snakes are arriving on Venice Beach, as they do in this novel. Not that Venice, but in California. And of course you're depressed, but maybe it's a reawakening. Maybe you're turning toward life rather than away from it. It's along the way in presenting the climate disaster, the impending climate disaster, the existing climate disaster, you have a character, our narrator, who must learn that depression might be the thing that he needs to be feeling if he's going to help the rest of us respond. That's quite a redefinition.
Well, I don't know if you saw the New York Times story today about the Yale psychologist who teaches a course on on depression and how she thinks all her students are sort of like perishing of anxiety. And I think it's really true. I think they do feel themselves to be in the grip of some power that they can't resist, and that is really the definition of demonic possession.
So, there you go. So, Dean stands in for readers who say, wait a minute, is this famous novelist actually... Chinta is a very important character. Chinta speaks the truth. Are we really talking about possession? She's redefining it as risveglio, but this is a chance for someone to say, wait, really? And then Dean evolves, and he wakes up to the situation. So I guess this is the moment where I ask you about the sophomoric question about Dean's relationship to you.
Dean is certainly not me. I mean, he's a middle-aged guy who lives in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Yes, that
He's
overlaps.
certainly not you.
But he doesn't
He
have a
likes
family.
books.
He doesn't have children. He doesn't have children. He's a single guy, completely different from me. So yeah, absolutely not the same. But
And but
if you're writing at my moment in life, there obviously has to be some atmosphere, some sort of overlap, some believability. I can hardly write in the voice of like a 20-year-old girl, you know? I mean, it has to be, there has to be some basis of credibility. And, you know, those things establish that basis of credibility. That's where I'm doing what you guys teach, which is write what you know. So that part of
Do I
it.
teach that? Well, I'll just push this slightly further. Dean, like Nirmal in this book, they both are people who don't think that they have the power to be political activists, who have regretted somewhat that, being a little more passive and really devoting themselves to writing in the case of Nirmal here, and in Dean's case, loving books, particularly old books. And so there's a way in which they are sharing your worry about how a political efficacy can come from writing. That is a concern of yours. So at least you share that with them. Am I way off?
You know, I don't think it's political, certainly in my case. I think what we really need is a profound kind of, how shall I say, an epistemological change, you know. Because, you know, you look at the politics of it, whether on the left or on the right, I mean, through the 20th century, what happened? I mean, both the left and the right were accelerationist in various ways. Whether you I mean, the Soviet Union or China, I mean, they were not capitalist by any means. But in fact, the environmental destruction was even greater, perhaps, in Russia or in China. You know, if you just read, I don't know if any of you guys know the work of Bathsheba Demuth. She's, I think, one of the most brilliant historians of our time. She's got a wonderful book on whaling, basically. And the sort of whaling that the Soviets were doing, even in the 50s and 60s, I mean, it really just makes your stomach turn, you know. And why were they doing it? It's because of, you know, the Stakhanovite sorts of incentives that were presented to producers in the Soviet Union, you know. So, you know, I think what we had in place there was this kind of accelerationism tied to a certain kind of industrial way of thinking. And all of that is ultimately tied to also the ways in which you see non-humans, the ways in which you see the world as just consisting of resources to be exploited. You know, the world has no normative meaning for you. It makes no normative or ethical demands upon you. It just exists for you to extract. And this seems to have, you know, gone across the political spectrum through most of the 20th century. So I would say that as I see it, I'm not even addressing, you know, what is thought of as politics. I think it's sort of more important for us to get our minds around these other things, as I said, you know, sort of like non-human agency and so on. And that's not something political in a ordinary sense.
Thank you. So let's turn to another part of this book toward the end, when there's a minor character named Palash, who is on the boat with the others as they rescue some refugees who are in a boat sailing northward in the Mediterranean. This is on 291 in Gun Island. And Palash tells his own story of migration, and that leads Dean, the narrator we've been talking about, to think about his own engagement with novels and the relationship between the web, the internet, providing you images that create a dream, and the novels of Dean's generation.
So this is Dean talking to Palash. "Why don't you go back home then," I said, "and take another job? Surely your family would help you find one." Palash is a migrant who's crossed the Mediterranean and ended up in Italy. He smiled ruefully, but I noticed that his eyes had begun to glisten. "It's impossible for me to go back now," said Palash. "My family still does not know that I dropped out of university and am now scraping by on the streets. My parents would not be able to imagine that a son of theirs was doing that kind of work. They think I'm still a student going to lectures and writing papers at my university. If I tell them the truth now, I would have to admit that I had been lying all along, that they were right to tell me not to go abroad, that I had made a terrible mistake and would have done better to listen to their advice. I would have to acknowledge that in chasing a dream, I destroyed my life. Was your dream a kind of curse then? I said. I suppose so, said Palash wearily. But everyone has a dream, don't they? And what is a dream but a fantasy? Think of all the people who come to see Venice. What's brought them there but a fantasy? They think they travel to the heart of Italy, to a place where they'll experience Italian history and eat authentic Italian food. Do they know that all of this is made possible by Bengalis like me? That it is we who are cooking their food and washing their plates and making their beds? Do they understand that no Italian does that kind of work anymore? That it's we who are fueling this fantasy, even as it consumes us? And why not? Every human being has a right to a fantasy, don't they? It is one of the most important human rights. It is what makes us different from animals. Haven't you seen how every time you look at your phone or a TV screen, there is always an ad telling you that you should do whatever you want, that you should chase your dream, that impossible is nothing, just do it? What else do these messages mean but that you should try to live your dream? You ask any Italian and they will tell you that they have a fantasy. Maybe they want to go to South America and see the Andes, or maybe they want to go to India and see the palaces and jungles. And if you're white, it's easy. You can go wherever you want and do anything you want. But we can't. When I look back now and ask myself why I was so determined to go to Finland, I always come back to this. I wanted to go there because the world told me I couldn't, because it was denied to me. When you deny people something, it becomes all the more desirable. As he was speaking, a strange sense of recognition began to dawn on me. It was as though I was seeing myself in Palash. I remembered the restlessness of my own youth and how it had been fed by another very powerful medium of dreams, novels, which I had read voraciously, especially savoring those that were about faraway places. I thought of my teenage years and all the time I had spent hunting for cheap paperbacks in the alleys and back lanes of Calcutta. Back in those days, there were very few bookshops in Calcutta, and their wares were far beyond my reach. Instead, I had frequented libraries and second-hand bookshops. Reading was my means, I thought, of escaping the narrowness of the world I lived in. But was it possible that my world had seemed narrow precisely because I was a voracious reader? After all, how can any reality match the worlds that exist only in books? Either way, the fact was that novels had done for me exactly what critics had anticipated when romances first began to circulate widely in the 18th century. They had created dreams and desires that were unsettling in the exact sense that they were the instruments of my uprooting. If mere words could have this effect, then what of the pictures and videos that scroll continuously past our eyes on laptops and cell phones? If it is true that a picture is worth 1,000 words, then what is the power of the billions of images that now permeate every corner of the globe? What is the potency of the dreams and desires they generate, of the restlessness they breed?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You interviewed people like Palash.
Oh, yes.
For all I know,
yes.
Palash is based on a particular person that you interviewed in Italy.
I mean, not directly what he said, but yeah, I mean, he was a very thoughtful young man from a upper middle class family in Bangladesh. His father was a civil servant. His brother was quite a successful banker. He himself had a good job in a multinational. But, and this is the thing, young people in Bangladesh have this kind of strange fantasy of Finland. There are articles about it. I've referenced some of them in the book. There are articles where they want to go to Finland. And so this guy was possessed by this desire to go to Finland. And he and 4 of his friends actually tried to make it happen. One of his friends managed to make it there, which thereafter became even more of an incentive. But Palash didn't make it, and he eventually ended up in Italy in a terrible circumstance where, he was living in this room with 10 migrants in Palermo, and he couldn't go home because of the loss of face. And he had to keep on, doing this work. And he was extremely intelligent and self-conscious about his circumstances. And he was shunned by many of the other Bangladeshis because he was middle class, whereas they were basically of peasant origin. So, it was extraordinary talking to him. He was a very reflective and interesting person.
And I'm very interested in how and why you, as the novelist creating Dean's narrative, turn to Dean seeing himself in Palash and to memories of reading novels and dreaming. Dean thinks I was like Palash, except the genre was novels, not internet-mediated desired places. Why make that turn back to the novel reading of someone of your generation?
Well, it's either novels or stories or films, or actually for people of my generation, really, the music of the American music of the 60s and 70s. I mean, that played such an immense part in our imaginative life. And I know that when I was talking to these kids, I know that, if I had been shut out like that, I would have done exactly what they did. I would have taken my chances on crossing the Mediterranean. But, it didn't work out like that. I had an education and so on. Palash had an education too. But, there's many a slip between cup and lip,
Well, thank you. For the final passage, we're going to turn back in time to a piece called The Town by the Sea, which is about the tsunami that hit a small island, I guess Nicobar, well, the whole Andamans and Nicobars, in December of 2004. And I'm going to ask you to read the last paragraphs of that piece, and of course invite you to set it up any way you want. You met a person you call the director, who had lost his wife and daughter in the tsunami.
You want me to read all of this?
Yeah,
Sure.
it's just the end. Yeah.
Okay. So after it so happened that I found myself in Calcutta on the 25th on Christmas Day, 2004, and the next day was the Boxing Day tsunami. And I had just finished writing a book which ends with a great tidal wave and so on. So I don't know, somehow, actually the governor of Bengal called me and said, "You predicted this in your book." And I said, "No, I didn't. It's just an uncanny coincidence." But I just felt that I had to go. So I went to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and, to see what had happened, because these islands had been completely devastated by the tsunami. But especially this particular island in the Nicobar chain. The Andamans are volcanic islands, but the Nicobar chain, they are coral islands, so very low-lying, so it had been completely devastated. So so I managed to fight my way onto an army plane that was delivering stuff to the Nicobar Islands. And when I got into the plane, I encountered this sort of person, a very nondescript person. I mean, just like a man in his 40s, looked just like a bureaucrat and was indeed a bureaucrat. So the Nicobar Islands are very low-lying. The indigenous inhabitants of the Nicobars understood what the sea was, and they never built any houses on the sea. They built houses a long way from the sea, so nothing happened to them. But the immigrants from India who moved to this place, all in typical emulation of Western lifestyle patterns and desires, had built their homes right on the sea, just right on the sea. And this isn't just ordinary people. Even the Indian Air Force had a base there that was built right on the sea. So in order of seniority, the senior-most person was closest to the sea. This is like Miami Beach. The richer you are, the closer you are to the sea. you know. So when the tsunami hit, and the tsunami actually occurred less than about 200 miles away from this particular place, because the tsunami, the earthquake that triggered the tsunami happened between the tip of Sumatra and the bottom of the Nicobar chain. So they were very close. So within minutes, the tsunami was, hit them. And, this extraordinary thing. So the moment it hit, it was so horrifying to see, the people who, in the Air Force Base, the people who, people died in the inverse order of seniority. Similarly, in this town, once the tsunami hit, in the town, actually, the entire town was razed, absolutely razed. The only things that remained were the foundations of houses and these and the coconut trees. Coconut trees are amazing. They just bend over like this and snap back. But it was an astonishing thing to go there because, in India, people cook with these canisters of gas like you have for like RVs over here. And somehow these canisters had been banged against each other and there were fires everywhere. So in the midst of this devastation, there were these fires. But anyway, so I found myself on a plane with this man who said he was the director of some sort of agency. He was a man ethnically from Odisha. And he had been away at some conference in the Nicobars. But his wife and daughter were in this town. The town was called Melaka. And they were in this town. And he hadn't heard from them since the tsunami. So he was going back for the first time. And I was with him on the plane. And we started talking. And I started following him around as he went looking for his house and for his wife and daughter. We came to a point where a rectangular platform of cement shone brightly under the sun. The director stepped up to it and placed his feet in the middle. "This was my house," he said. "Only the foundation was concrete. The rest was wood. My wife used to say that she had moved from a white house to a log cabin. You see, she was from an affluent family. She grew up in a bungalow with an air conditioner. She used to teach English in a school here, but she always wanted to leave. I applied many times, but the transfer never came." He paused, thinking back. For much of the time that we had been together, his voice had carried a note of sharp but undirected annoyance. Now it softened. "There was so much she could have achieved," he said. "I was never able to give her the opportunity." I reached out to touch his arm, but he shook my hand brusquely away. He was not the kind of man who takes kindly to expressions of sympathy. I could tell from his demeanor that he was accustomed to adversity and had invented many rules for dealing with it. The emotion he felt for his family he had rarely expressed. He had hoarded it inside himself, in the way a squirrel gathers food for the winter. Loath to spend it in his hectic middle years, he had put it away to be savored when there was a greater sense of ease in his life, at a time when his battles were past, and he could give his hoarded love his full attention. He had never dreamt, and who could, that one bright December day soon after dawn, it would be stolen unsavored by the sea. I began to walk towards the gently lapping waves, no more than 100 meters away. The director took fright at this and called me back. "Don't go that way. The tide is coming in. It's time to leave." I turned to follow him, and we were heading back towards the blazing palms when he stopped to point to a yellow paint box peeping out of the rubble. "That belonged to Vinita, my daughter," he said. And the flatness of his voice was harder to listen to than an outburst would have been. "She loved to paint. She was very good at it. She was even given a prize from Hyderabad." I had expected he would stoop to pick up the box, but instead he turned away and walked on. "Wait," I cried. "Don't you want to take the box?" "No," he said vehemently, shaking his head. "What good will it do? What will it give back?" He stopped to look at me over the rim of his glasses. "Do you know what happened the last time I was here? Someone had found my daughter's school bag and saved it for me. It was handed to me like a card. It was the worst thing I could have seen. It was unbearable." He started to walk off again. Unable to restrain myself, I called out after him, "Are you sure you don't want it, the paint box?" Without looking around, he said, "Yes, I am sure." I stood amazed as he walked off towards the blazing fire, with his slide still folded in his grip. How was it possible that the only memento he had chosen to retrieve were those magnified images? As a husband, a father, a human being, it was impossible not to wonder, what would I have done? What would I have felt? What would I have chosen to keep of the past? The truth is, nobody can know except in the extremity of that moment. And then the choice is not a choice at all, but an expression of the innermost sovereignty of the self, which decides because nothing now remains to cloud its vision. In the manner of his choosing, there was not a particle of hesitation, not the faintest glimmer of a doubt. Was it perhaps that in this moment of utter desolation, there was some comfort in the knowledge of an impersonal effort? Could it be that he was seeking refuge in the one aspect of his existence that could not be erased by an act of nature? Or was there some consolation in the very lack of immediacy? Did the value of the slides that he had found lie precisely in their exclusion from the unendurable pain of his loss? Whatever the reason, it was plain his mind had fixed upon a set of objects that derived their meaning from the part of his life that was lived in thought and contemplation. There are times when words seem futile, and to no one more so than a writer. At these moments, it seems that nothing is of value other than to act and to intervene in the course of events. To think, to reflect, to write seems trivial and wasteful. But the life of the mind takes many forms, and sometime after the day had passed, I understood that in the manner of his choosing, the director had mounted the most singular, the most powerful defense of it that I would ever witness.
Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you. You can do a few.
We have just a couple of minutes for a few questions. And Zach, do we have a portable mic? And what I'd like to
I'm
remind
sure I can
everybody-
hear anyone. It's a small
Well,
room.
we get a recording, you know.
Oh.
And I remind everybody that tomorrow at 10:30 we're going to have a whole hour of Q&A. So, Kalia, do you have the mic? Is that what's Yes, somebody want to ask a question? Sorry to spring that on you all at the last minute. Any question at all, we would love to hear it. It's hard to follow that last piece. Beautiful last paragraph about the writer's obligation to bear witness.
There's a question over here.
Thank you for that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
For that incredible reading. I'll have to ask you later where the last piece was from. I sort of missed that. That was incredibly
The Town
powerful.
by the Sea, and it's on his website.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to where we started about storytelling and how that may connect us to our wild selves, right? I'd be interested in hearing from you how linearity, as not a storyteller, I'm a poet, not a novelist, not a storyteller, how linearity functions, if at all. Is that endemic to storytelling? I hope not. Because in trying to represent these other beings, non-human animals, how does linearity function? Because you mentioned in terms of the example of the dog sequence. Because when I imagine most animals, including the ones we live with, I imagine their experiences to be utterly unlike ours. So their forms of their sequential experiences or non-sequential experiences or their story making would be very different from ours. So would be curious, because I thought about linearity, and I resist linearity in my own work, and I've read yours, and I believe you do too, how that relates. So if you're not a storyteller in the conventional sense, some other kind of artist, how do you represent the other, as you're urging us to do?
Thank you. That's a very good question. When we think of the absolute otherness of animals and so on, I wonder why we think that, because after all, we co-evolved. You know, I mean, so many of the experiences are actually so comparable, you know. And we have to remember also that the idea that there's an absolute otherness of experience, the place that it comes from was really the idea that of, let's say, a human-centeredness, you know, which arises basically out of the Enlightenment in the 17th, 18th centuries, that human experience is substantially completely different from all other experiences and so on. But when these philosophers like Descartes and so on came up with this idea, they didn't mean all humans, you know. They really basically meant, you know, white European men. You know, everybody else was a brute. And the brute similarly didn't have was incapable of constructing linear experience, of understanding linear experience, you know, all those things. So I think, you know, in the first place, that should alert us to the possible problem. You know, what is it that we are being taken in for? What is the story that we are being sold here? And I think once we approach it from that position, we begin to have, I think, a substantially different approach to the possibility of non-human storytelling. Look, I am not a person who can claim to tell non-human stories as such. But in human life, there have always existed people who have made claims to communications with non-humans and who have been able to tell non-human stories. And, you know, some of these people, maybe the majority, maybe 90% or 99% of these people were charlatans. But some of them were the most respected people of their age, like St. Francis of Assisi. You know, and he's just one. I'm giving you that example because you know, he was a Westerner. But there are so many people. I mean, the whole shamanic experience is exactly this, of being able to communicate with the non-human, and it isn't easy. You know, they go through extremely rigorous training processes, and almost always there's some botanical substance involved. So it's always a collaboration between different kinds of non-human agencies. And the botanical agency is a very important agency in that regard, you know. So I don't see why we should rule out this possibility. I mean, we know that, you know, there are humans who have an almost uncanny gift for mathematics, you know, like Ramanujan did. You know, numbers were his friends, you know. So I don't see how we can rule out that, you know, some human beings actually have these uncanny abilities. In fact, we all know, you know, humans who do have these, you know, who are very good with dogs, for example, or with horses. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen Seabiscuit, you know, which is a movie I completely love. And it's really about, you know, giving voice and agency to a non-human. You know, so, you know, to me, I must say, I don't see that this is, I think really the question that needs to be asked is the opposite one. How did we come to persuade ourselves that only humans have agency and these abilities?
Thank you, Mir, for the question. Let's take one more question, and then we'll go to book signing and greeting. And Kalia's got the mic.
There's a question over here, I think.
Oh, it's a fidget, but sure.
Oh wait, you were fidgeting.
I was fidgeting. I was just wondering, like, how has, I mean, it's maybe an obvious question, but like, how has...
Here comes the mic.
Oh, do I need it? Okay. How do you think about the questions that you're wrestling with in the context of the pandemic? I've just been thinking about what, the point you made about the kind of limits of standard mainstream political ideology in combating a lot of what, I mean, it's really, as I think the word you used was epistemological, or kind of in some ways more philosophical than that. And a lot of that has also been said about the pandemic and responses to the pandemic, that it's kind of a moment that in some ways has both shown kind of left and right governments have had adequate and inadequate responses, that it doesn't really neatly map onto that particular spectrum. Do you see that as a productive moment for the kind of shift that you're kind of calling for, or do you actually see it as kind of more a call, more a kind of underscoring of the challenges, or maybe both. But I just kept coming back to kind of images from the last, that all of us have been grappling with the last 18 months in the context of what you're saying. So it was more a thought, which is why it's a fidget more than a fully articulated question. But that's what I was thinking.
Well, this book was written entirely during the pandemic. I started it on March 8th, and I finished it in October 2020. So it's a lot of it is actually about the pandemic and so on. In the first place, I think the pandemic really, it's like a 1765 moment for us. 1765 was the Great Lisbon earthquake, when Voltaire and suddenly, all those people suddenly woke up to the fact that, humans haven't mastered nature, I mean, they were very bright, but this they didn't get, until the earthquake reminded them. And I think that's certainly the moment here too. But I think the pandemic has really completely, upturned so many of our conventional understandings of the world. I mean, if you just take where the best outcomes have been, all of that, it's a complete reversal of conventional knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you very much once again. This was an extraordinary reading. Amitav Ghosh,
Thank you.
Kelly Writers House Fellow.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight. And we have books for sale. Amitav will stay right here, and he'll inscribe copies of your book.
Yes.
And say hello to you. Remember, tomorrow we're back at 10:30. Thank you again for joining us for Kelly Writers House Fellow. And one more time, Amitav Ghosh. Thank you.
And please come and see Jungle Nama if you can, if there are seats available.
March 2nd and 3rd, 7 p.m.